All right, so welcome everybody to the Ethnic Studies Colloquium series, fall 2014. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. We have a very special guest that I'm very excited to introduce. We have Dr. L. Joyce Mariano. What is it? I actually don't even know.
Lorena.
Lorena? Okay, I did not know that until some of you guys may already know her, but if you don't, I'm just going to say a few short things. She's an assistant professor of American Studies here at UH, Mano. And prior to Hawaii, she held the Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellowship in Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And that's where she began work on her book manuscript, which is titled Charity Begins at Home, Filipino Diaspora and the Politics of Giving. She earned both of her advanced degrees from the University of Minnesota, earning her PhD in American Studies in 2011. In addition to core American Studies undergraduate and graduate courses, she teaches courses on Filipino American experience and Asian American cultural politics, and she recently shared with me that she loves singing Bruce Springsteen songs. And I probably wasn't supposed to reveal that.
That's how I relax.
So maybe at some point.
I should just do it right now.
Yeah. So yeah, please join me in welcoming Joyce Mariano.
Thanks, Ryan.
No, thank you.
Yeah. But thank you sincerely to Brian Chung and the Ethnic Studies Colloquium series for inviting me to talk and share my ideas, and for you guys for coming out. I want to say that I'm touched that you're here, but that's not the right word. But I'm very grateful for the community here at UH. You guys are great. I look forward to your feedback and response and suggestions. But thank you. In this presentation, I look to one Filipino American transnational environmental justice organization and its programming involving mostly young college-to-age, second-generation Filipino Americans as an opportunity to contemplate the relationship between ecology, right, the relationships between living things and their environments, and a critical politics of diaspora responsibility. This attention to diaspora and the cultural politics of diaspora formation recognizes the difficult terrain of doing environmental and political work when negotiating social relationships produced by material difference and histories of colonialism and neocolonialism, right, even for an immigrant group given back to the Philippines. The leaders of the organization under study and its program participants are framed here as citizens of a colonial state that is also in a neocolonial economic and political relationship with the Philippines. When Filipino American organizations create programs or projects to help or to give back to poor communities in the Philippines, there is always the risk of reproducing colonial structures and the elitism and paternalism that are embedded in charitable social relationships. The organization I look to understands this risk and is able to use its transnational environmental justice platform to respond to and intervene in dominant ways of giving back, including but not limited to social development, philanthropy, humanitarianism, and volunteerism. Formed in 2000 through a network of activists, scientists, and students, the organization I look at is called FACES, Filipino American Coalition for Environmental Solidarity, FACES, which originally came together to advocate for communities affected by toxic waste left on former U.S. military bases in the Philippines. I came to know FACES through interviews with board members, through analyses of organizational materials, and largely through participation on its face-to-face solidarity trip in the Philippines and subsequent interviews with several of its participants. The solidarity trip targeted young Filipinos who did not necessarily have a familiarity with the organization, but an interest in environmentalism and this being Filipino, this idea of being Filipino. The face-to-face solidarity trip creates a framework for its participants to re-articulate Filipino-ness through an experiential analysis, the production of global injustice that values Western capitalist accumulation over Philippine spaces and Filipino bodies. The trip helped participants see how society operates to produce spaces that are more likely to be exposed to hazardous more likely to be exposed to hazardous waste brought on by the military, by industry, and state governments than others. Recognizing this, we can imagine how this toxicity naturalizes spatial difference, obstructing potential coalitions and communities as hazardous waste sites are tied to social divisions and hierarchies of class, gender, race, and sexuality. FACES gathered 15 participants for its inaugural face-to-face solidarity trip from across the US to tour, so to speak, these toxic hotspots, or locales where community members were fighting for their families and neighborhoods that had been made environmentally uninhabitable by the US military and exploitive practices brokered by multinational corporations in the Philippines. One of the participants on the inaugural face-to-face solidarity trip, Paul Ramos, compared his experience with FACES to other exposure trips that focus on Filipino culture, where culture is distinct from politics. He says, quote, "I really liked the trip. I didn't even know it was more political. I thought it would be more environmental because that's what got me interested in the first place, was the environmental aspect of it. But I guess it comes with it. The political aspect comes with the environmental aspect. But I really like the environmental approach, using that view to see, as a starting point, to look at all these problems that were interconnected. Environmental issues I've been kind of involved with since high school, like toxic waste and recycling. That's what I was really interested in, using this environmental waste to be all these other aspects that were political, transnational, government, and like people. So that's what I like. As a Filipino, I think I got more personally because it was environmental, like if I went to a different, like foundation-based tour." When Ramos references foundation-based tours, he means other return trips targeted toward young Filipino Americans, particularly a much celebrated Developing Potential Leaders return trip, which was started by one of the Philippines' largest corporate conglomerates and sponsored by the Chevron Corporation. Drawing relationships among the environment, Filipino identity, and this nascent critique of corporate foundation-based tours, Ramos effectively illustrates how environmental justice efforts are placed, not only in terms of Filipino Americans oriented toward the Philippine homeland and environmental destruction in the Philippines, but in relationship to the transnational cultural, political, and economic production of the environment as a historical object. Additionally, Ramos understands environmental justice as part of a larger field of diaspora, homeland, giving practices, and politics. Other permutations of diasporic return through corporate responsibility programs that court Filipino Americans, aid, and or volunteerism in the Philippines. In the context of these other forms of giving and diasporic return, I am mindful of the homeland nationalisms, memories, and love that may orient a Filipino American toward the country or region of origin, as well as the movements, histories, and hierarchies that inform how Filipino Americans envisage their given practices in the Philippines. As the ostensible object of development for diaspora giving projects, competing meanings of homeland, what it evokes, how it should be protected, emerge at the intersection of individual, community, national, and transnational forces, meanings that inform the terms of belonging and responsibility for Filipino Americans. How the space of the homeland, its problems, its appropriate solutions, and its complexity, right, how the homeland is framed by giving, draws attention to the significance of philanthropy, development, and social movements in enacting diasporic identities. Giving does not generally include activists or social movement organizations for the political or ideological positions that they may take. But just like with the nostalgia of homeland, there's a tendency to want to see philanthropy or volunteerism as outside of the messiness of politics and power. Denaturalizing giving, we see why this is problematic. Analysis of the narratives of diaspora giving disrupts the fantasies of philanthropy, the activism, or humanitarianism as separate phenomena and as social goods onto themselves, and instead situates the ideological investments of particular mobilizations. Environmental politics are an important site in which to analyze the spatial politics of diasporic critique and to denaturalize both giving and homeland. The remainder of this paper is structured in two parts. So part one is called The Beautiful Philippine Environment, Capitalism, Militarism, Diaspora, and Giving. It covers how the Philippine environment and Filipino bodies are essentialized as a tropical island paradise by tourism and militarism, but also by diasporic Filipino giving projects. In the latter, we can understand how giving and the terms of diasporic return is then cordoned off from opportunities to denaturalize and decolonize dominant discourses of Philippine environments and Filipino bodies. Part two returns to the FACES organization and the face-to-face solidarity trip, FACES and a critical politics of diaspora responsibility and return. So I return to how the FACES organization reimagines a different kind of environment with different possibilities for these ideas of responsibility. Part one. Often mistakenly perceived as the provenance of the political left, environmentalist politics in general remain subject to contingencies, open to available elements that dictate its discourse and control. The following is an interesting and kind of typical. It's more interesting than typical. It's a travel guide description of what tourists can expect to find in the Philippines. Please bear with me as I quote it at length. It says, bad press in recent years, after some high-profile terrorism and kidnapping incidents, have not helped matters. The country has also labored under a turbulent political reputation and is still overcoming the effects of martial law. Its poor infrastructure, dilapidated roads, and unsafe ferries have also all played a role in deterring potential travelers, and the country has been overlooked as an eco-tourist destination because of local disregard for the natural resources, such as fishermen dynamiting coral reefs. The good news is that Filipinos themselves are warm and welcoming, as understood in the country's tagline, where Asia wears a smile. Apart from some beautiful remote tropical islands and legendary scuba diving spots, the archipelago's best resource is the friendliness and laid-back attitude of the Filipino people. Their hospitable and embracing attitude is enough to put a smile on any visitor's face. The Philippines has some superb, all-inclusive luxury resorts spread around the islands which cushion visitors from the general degradation and safety risks of the cities and towns. And a major plus is that the country is amazingly good value. Also, the food is delicious and English is widely spoken. Ecotourism merges environmental politics with touristic capitalistic accumulation. Reports of political upheaval scare away would-be tourists and their tourist dollars, and the environment exists so far as it is made available to meet consumer tourist demands for paradise-like conditions. Destruction or abuse of the environment is mourned not for its effects on the health, quality of life, or livelihoods of Filipinos, but for its arrest of an ecotourism industry. Those Filipinos that bear the weight of underdevelopment are taken out of the context of the global economic order, their labor and bodies serving the needs of Western consumer demands, and made into a part of the landscape itself. While there may be Islamic terrorists, right, also known as movements for indigenous sovereignty, right, the warmth and hospitality and smiles of the Filipinos work to mitigate the inconveniences a tourist might encounter because of the conditions of poverty. As such, the Philippines' own identity as the place where Asia wears a smile performs work beyond the masking of widespread poverty and exploitation. The smiles do the ideological work of containing political protests and dissent, presenting the people as essentially content and harmless, advocating a most toothless environmentalist imagination defined against movements for social change. It's possible from this formulation to link this and similar environmental imagery to the sexualization of the country's tourism industry developed during the martial law era of Ferdinand Marcos. so stated by Cynthia Enlow in her influential Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, quote, Marcos and his advisors, with encouragement from foreign banks and technical consultants, had viewed tourism as a primary building block of development. The regime had used the reputed beauty and generosity of Filipino women as natural resources to compete in the international tourism market. Sex tourism in the Philippines is part and parcel of the environment as island paradise. Now consider, I have another slide. Now consider for a quick moment how Jesse the Body Ventura, I'm going back to Minnesota, he was the governor of Minnesota. So how Jesse Body Ventura sings the praises of the Philippines for an example, for just a quick example of the dominant sexualization and investment in the Filipina, located in red light districts designed to service the U.S. military. He writes, quote, I love the Philippines. I was stationed at Subic, and I loved going into Olongapo. It is more like the Wild West than any other place on earth. In Olongapo, there's a 1-mile stretch of road that has 350 bars and 10,000 girls on it every night. To the kid I was then, it was paradise. When a girl went with you to Olongapo, there was no question what you were going to do. Ventura participates in a discourse that constructs the Philippines and Filipinas as paradise. And to borrow from the important work of one Bernadette Gonzalez, that requires, quote, a suspension of a critique of the neo-colonial Philippine economy that ensures and distinguishes the privileged positions these men occupy in Philippine society. The tendency to narrate the environmental space of the Philippines through its beauty and the simultaneous declaration and then dismissal of the harsh conditions of life for many Filipinos belongs not only to the marketing industry and militarism, however. Filipino studies sociologist Rick Bonas observes in his ethnography a tendency among first-generation Filipinos in the U.S. to describe the Philippine homeland as, quote, pure, natural, and paradise-like. Quote, that's how we want to remember the Philippines, they say. Bonas considers their idyllic nostalgia as an expression of the difficulties of immigrant life, a coping mechanism in the face of harsh or unexpected circumstances. The idealization of the space of the Philippines as paradise by Filipino Americans, even when produced as coping mechanisms by minoritized subjects, draw upon narratives or fictions of the beauty and innocence of the homeland, dismissing the complexity of struggle in the Philippines, integrating the conditions of their own racialization. Building on Bonas's analysis, this description of Filipino Americans by Philippine Paradise holds significant reverberations in the study of diasporic giving. Consider the following description of Filipino American diaspora giving by Angelo Alaan, an active leader in his region and a current and past president and board member of multiple Filipino American associations and organizations, most of which engage in programs of diaspora giving. He says, quote, as I said, we do a lot of charitable giving to the Philippines. It shows the good heart of Filipinos. Filipinos in the U.S. can help Filipinos in the Philippines in many ways. One is keeping our pride and honor in being Filipino Americans. Because if they hear us saying we're proud to be a Filipino, or I'm proud that I originated from the Philippines, they hear that in the Philippines, especially those hard-up people, then morale goes up and they become proud of themselves. They have problems in the Philippines, but we should emphasize more the good things in the Philippines that we do find good, like what we do find good, especially Filipino characteristics. We have a great Filipino character, and we are beautiful as a people. We are a beautiful and hospitality-minded people, and the Philippines is very beautiful. I always mention that to my friends. We have a beautiful country, the Philippines, and lots of great natural resources. So what I'm saying is talk positively about the Philippines and the people, because that's us, actually. Recognizing the beautiful homeland of the Philippines becomes the extent of the good diasporic subject. Alaan gestures toward general problems in the Philippines, but his remedy is to celebrate the racialized and gendered space of the homeland and of Native Filipinos. He may confront his own racialization with a commitment to diaspora giving, but he argues the greatest charity would be for Filipino Americans to have pride in themselves, which would encourage even the most impoverished in the Philippines towards psychic and material betterment. There are problems in the Philippines, but of greater concern, even for homeland giving, is that Filipinos be recognized for their hospitality and the country for its beauty. In an uncomfortable parallel with Jesse Ventura, there is this slippage between the Philippine landscape and Filipino bodies in their natural beauty and simplicity, which enables a privileged position over the embodied or psychic lives of Filipinos in the Philippines. So philanthropy from Filipinos to Filipinos it's not supposed to support the same discourses that allow Ventura to unabashedly love the Philippines as sexual island paradise, ready to serve the US military as it sees fit. From its Greek roots, philanthropy means love to mankind. And diaspora longings for an originary homeland also attach themselves to the language of love, as well as to the language of family, patriotism, and nation. Allahans dictate to talk positively about the Philippines and the people because that's us actually, promotes an illusory solidarity. Filipino American diasporic responsibility here undergirds the objectification of native Filipinos, particularly in how the class status and cultural citizenship of Filipino Americans and their homeland returns is framed by Allah'an just in and of itself as a benefit to poor Filipinos in the Philippines. The dominant representation of the Philippine environment is steeped in neocolonial demand regarding the utility of the Philippines, its environment, and its people. Therefore, to intervene in colonial investments in the environment, one must take seriously the conditions and opportunities of the people who live and work in the Philippines. The environment of the Philippines, as widely represented, naturalizes hierarchical social relations, supporting an environmentalism that silences the colonial other, not necessarily by presuming to speak for the other, but by fusing the smiling Filipino with the beautiful landscape. Therefore, calling into question the environment's status as beautiful and as timeless rearticulates the Philippine environment as a site of political struggle, a move that parallels the unsettling of homeland and points to environmental justice politics as political struggles over sexualized and racially structured environments and bodies. In other words, how then can we denaturalize dominant Philippine environments in diaspora and in the ways that Filipino Americans create projects and frameworks of responsibility and social change? Part 2. In imagining a critical politics of diaspora responsibility, ideas of responsibility and giving take on multiple meanings. Accountability must be taken for the spaces and subjectivities produced in giving relationships, like recipient, philanthropist, the needy, the expert, the giver, and the like. By pursuing counter-hegemonic ways of giving that address the hierarchies against which diaspora giving purportedly sets itself. Organizations such as FACES, I argue, open the possibilities of belonging in and to the Philippine homeland by working to create a space not of common origins, but toward the cultivation of alternative diasporic responsibilities, expanding our giving imaginations to wider-reaching coalition building and partnerships. I don't think I have a slide for a little while.
Gotcha.
Just waking you up. Issues of responsibility in our giving relationships are also about awareness of taking too much responsibility. Taking too much responsibility can refer to unilateral efforts for improving the Philippines or paternalistic giving projects to alleviate the symptoms of poverty or underdevelopment, resulting in projects that, while driven by a deep desire by migrants to help the Philippines, emphasize our separateness and reinforce power imbalance, positioning Filipino Americans as wholly outside the maintenance of inequality in the Philippines. I argue that a critical politics of diaspora responsibility must take these multiple meanings of responsibility and giving into account. This combination of taking responsibility for that potential for reestablishing hierarchy through the ways that we give, and not taking too much responsibility in terms of claiming a privileged place for oneself in homeland, in the crucible of diaspora and diaspora formation, is why I turn to the example of FACES and the face-to-face solidarity trip. FACES transnational environmental justice politics complicates both dominant environmentalist discourse and essentialist Filipino American diasporic identities that return to our romanticized Philippine homeland. It does so by re-articulating Filipino American identities, responsibilities, and spaces with corporate exploitation, militarist destruction, and the dominant racialization, gendering, and sexualization of Filipinos. The face-to-face solidarity trip offers an experience that FACES produces in order to shape how Filipino Americans relate to homeland through return trips and in commitments to giving and responsibility. This framework of diaspora giving, significantly, emerged in the organization out of a moment of failure. The FACES organization had sued the U.S. Department of Defense on behalf of Philippine communities that were affected by toxic waste left by the U.S. military. They sued the U.S. and they lost. In the process, however, the organization forced themselves to reimagine their commitments and the nature of their responsibility. I quickly cover this history in what follows to address a moment of organizational transformation as fundamental to a larger transformation in the mobilization of diaspora. In the early 1990s, the Philippine Senate voted to reject a treaty that would have extended the lease for the Subic Bay Naval Station, which is one of the U.S. military's largest overseas facilities at the time. The U.S. military left its former bases in the Philippines in disastrous conditions. According to a 1992 U.S. General Accounting Office report, the naval facility lacked a complete sewage and treatment system and discharged untreated sewage and process waste waters directly into Subic Bay. Naval repair facilities dumped lead and other heavy metals directly into the water or buried the metals in landfill. Power plants emitted untreated pollutants into the air. Firefighting facilities with no drainage systems left fuel and chemicals used in firefighting exercises to seep directly into the soil and water table. And the military abandoned waste-filled underground storage tanks lacking leak detection equipment, and so on. FACES and its partner organizations in the U.S. and the Philippines held that the toxic waste was linked to extraordinarily high instances of stillborns, birth defects, and cancers in communities adjacent to the naval base through exposure and consumption of toxin in the water and soil. In 2003, FACES, along with ARC Ecology, an environmental justice organization in California, along with 36 Philippine residents of the vicinities of Subic, as well as Clark Air Base in Pampanga, they brought a precedent-setting legal suit against the U.S. government, seeking the international enforcement of CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, and access to the Environmental Superfund of the U.S. Congress to clean up the toxic mess. The Ninth Circuit Court, in very direct language, ruled that CERCLA was not intended to apply overseas and sided with the Department of Defense. In this ruling, the U.S. government reproduced the Philippines as a highly militarized, sacrificial landscape, in opposition to those environmental spaces that are worth saving and protecting. Sociologist Valerie Kulitz documents a geography of sacrifice where the government and industry identify expendable spaces for pursuits known to destroy the environment, such as those for weapons testing, nuclear development, and uranium mining. Again, how can we denaturalize the sacrificial landscapes of colonization and neocolonization in diaspora, and in the ways that Filipino Americans create projects and frameworks of responsibility? It is this something else that opens a space for different kinds of relationships and logics. After losing their court battle and forced to reevaluate its goals as an organization, FACES designed the affirmation face-to-face solidarity trip in conjunction with their organizational rehaul. The organization leaders took participants on a 2-week tour in the Philippines where they were introduced to a dozen partner organizations and community groups. The types of environmental justice groups and organizations were varied. The participants, for example, learned of the history of oil corporations Shell and Chevron in Pandacan, Metro Manila, and their ability to influence policy so that they could maintain oil depots that were right in the middle of their urban communities. And we heard lectures by the Philippine community members in Pandacan who were organizing in protest of the alarming levels of benzene and dioxins found in their environment. The participants spent a day with residents of Marilao, Bulacan, where the people live and most of whom work at an automotive lead-acid battery recycling plant, Philippine Recyclers, which is a subsidiary of Los Angeles-based Ramcar Batteries, which had a recycling plant located on the banks of their local water source. The participants heard from a former employee of Philippine Recyclers whose blood was found to have high levels of lead, and he had recently received death threats from neighbors because of his actions speaking against the company, because all of his neighbors were employed by Philippine Recyclers. It was their livelihood. An understanding of the environmentalist dictate to recycle was given new meaning as the group witnessed the impact on people's health by the environmental destruction of this American-based recycling company. In Olongapo, near the former Subic Naval Base, the participants stayed at the People's Recovery, Empowerment, Development, and Assistance Foundation, which assists sexually abused children and child prostitutes in the red light district that remains in the area even after the exit of the military bases, the formal exit, and heard a lecture given by the director on how the city and the provincial government support and help build the sex industry in the area, which continues today to be frequented by former American servicemen. Each of these groups connected what was happening either in their own communities or or to the people that they serve. They were connecting what was happening to their environmental justice goals. There was one organization in particular that the participants on the face-to-face solidarity trip that they were significantly impacted by. It was called Buklod, and it's a women's organization in Zambales that organizes current and former prostitutes and advocates for the welfare of Amerasians in the area. As a member of the Metro Subic network, Buklod held the network's leadership in 2005. So it was this organization that was leading the local groups, organizing the local groups toward this toxic cleanup of the area. The participants of Face to Face were asked to serve as election monitors for the organization elections. Members of Buklod took all of the participants to the city's red light district as the members were canvassing for new members. So it took them on a tour of the local bars in the red light district. And members of Buklod and its partner organization, Movement of Amerasians for Solidarity and Social Assistance, joined the Faces group for a night of story and food exchange. On the Buklod-led red light district bar outing, the spectacle of older white Americans, many of whom can be presumed are former military men who had been stationed in the Philippines. And I had heard one conversation between one of the trip participants and an older white American man who had moved to the Philippines because, quote, in his words, quote, it is such a beautiful place to be. But they were drinking and playing pool with Filipinas in the Olongapo bars. But it did not initially appear to have a purpose for the participants, aside from its initial shock value. But it was important for the Faces organization and for Buklod, the participants were later told. It was important to demonstrate how the body of the Filipina is integral to narratives of American military masculinity, particularly in speaking to this group of Filipino Americans. Participants connected to homeland and environmental justice in the Philippines through the social and political struggle of the Filipino organizing in the sex work industry. Participant Mariah Velasco describes how she, quote, had been overwhelmed with doubt, having only been witness to the socioeconomic effects of the U.S. military and its legacy, aka the Red Light District, bordering the former Subic Naval Base, end quote, struggling to redefine the power and meaning of U.S. military might. In the environmental justice politics of FACES, sex work in the Philippines is tied to the U.S. military and the environmental devastation and economic control of the Philippines by the military. Prostitution is directly tied to the colonization of Philippine environmental spaces and bodies. The organization politics and programs define Filipino American ethnic and diasporic identity in terms of the potential for a social justice orientation toward the Philippines. Because of charities and philanthropy's history of producing knowledge of self and other that reflect and legitimate the social order, self-critique becomes an intrinsic component of critical diaspora-giving politics. Doing so redefines the possibilities of homeland. Here, giving practices are not about doing good or helping others, but conceived through subjectivities that are bound up with those others in the Philippines and other spaces impacted by U.S. imperialism, corporate destruction, and environmental justice. But what is more, however, is that FACES also enabled participants to intervene in racialized gender and sexuality constructs that would enforce the condemnation of prostitutes in the Philippines. Participants heard stories of how Filipino sex workers were marginalized in society. For example, when Buklod members recalled stories of how Amerasian youth were refused job after job for how their mixed racedness signaled a mother working in the sex industry. In this context, the marginalization of prostitutes in Filipino society is a colonial and neo-colonial force that would disallow a sex worker's right to fight for her health and environmental safety. From an interview post-trip, Paul Ramos, one of the participants previously quoted, describes, quote, I really like the vice president from Buklod and her story. She was a prostitute. I was talking to her and I knew it was an old prostitute group, but I didn't know that all or most of them did that. I thought they had needed educated women to help them build the thing. I didn't know that they started it themselves or that they were prostitutes. I was like, okay, tell me about you. Well, I used to be that. And I was like, are you sure? Okay, wow, because I didn't see it. And she was the vice president. She's been to New York for all the conferences, and I was like, wow, she had to do it because she's the oldest. And it was her responsibility for her, and her dad got sick, and so instead of going to high school, she did it. She was looking for a job, but all the signs were like GRO needed, guest relations officer, friendly euphemism. And there were a lot of American military that the businesses catered to, and she fit the role. Now I was like, she's still intelligent, and she can talk, she can charm people. She talked about Buklod, and then their programs, and then their projects, and then the future. End quote. Ramos understands the historical and political agency of the Buklod leader through, and not despite, her labor. His sense of self as a 1.5 generation Filipino American and of the Philippines was altered in a way that could facilitate conscious relationships. Environmental degradation is connected to people and communities, but also to labor, militarism, and the racialized gender exploitation of spaces and bodies. This possibility for a decolonized gender, sexual, and racial politics lays the groundwork for a critical framework of diaspora responsibility. Another participant of this face-to-face solidarity trip, Jake Allen, describes, quote, FACES was good at bringing us questions that we would have never seen if we were just on vacation. Bringing a transnational diasporic analysis to the Philippine environment, it unsettles romanticized sentiments of the Philippine island paradise through the prospect of returning to the Philippines, not as a tourist eager to experience or re-experience the beauty of the Philippine homeland, but as one engaged in a critical environmental politics where the unmooring of the Philippines as paradise parallels the troubling of absolute belonging to a homeland detached from colonial histories, U.S. militarism, and the differentiations of culturally, racially, and gender-specific forms and operations of work. While I focus on a critical politics of diasporic responsibility, I end this paper knowing that the organizational transformation of FACES opens up important related conversations that I hope to explore in the future. For example, how can we theorize this moment of diasporic possibility in relationship to the reification of a generational divide between U.S. immigrants and their children, but while still understanding the multiple intensities, knowledge, and commitments toward homeland from diaspora? Alternatively, how can Filipino diaspora studies contribute to conversations related to settler colonialism as a mode of critique? Critical diaspora studies problematizes the diasporic subject to the homeland, but what of the relationship to the United States and the multiple meanings of homeland belonging and displacement? At the very least, how do we seek to understand efforts to decolonize gender, sexual, racial, and giving politics as informing what diaspora, homeland, and responsibility can even mean and entail? Thank you.
So we still have some extra time, so usually I open up for Q&A, so if anybody has any questions for Joyce.
Yeah, I have
Sorry, I totally skipped a whole page. I'm like, why? I hope that made sense. I could read it now, but it's right in the middle. I wouldn't make it sense. I'm just kidding. I apologize. Hi.
thank you very much. It was very good, even with the skipping.
Oh my God, it was a good one too.
Quick question. I understand the notion of like diaspora and the commitment of diasporic Filipinos in the United States, for instance, to go and do whatever they were doing there, like as you have talked about it. But what I'm not sure about is whether you have been, or this spaces has been working alongside or in conjunction with some political groups. I'm not talking about NGOs and stuff like that, but other political groups in the Philippines. And to what extent did these political groups looking at the work of FACES in terms of like effectiveness and effectiveness?
In terms of effectiveness.
Forget about effectiveness in terms of what they've been doing.
Formal politics in the Philippines is different in the U.S. in that you can have members of the representatives who are part of kind of rabble-rousing national democratic parties, like formal political parties. That there are members in their House of Representatives, and so they did. One of the places that this particular face-to-face solidarity trip did visit was one connected with the National Democratic Front, and it was really interesting for thinking about it from a researcher's standpoint, because he was talking a lot about how it was their responsibility as Filipino Americans to understand the history and legacy of colonialism, U.S. colonization, as well as how not just in terms of sovereignty, but also the way that it kind of solidified the oligarchy and the land tenure system of the Philippines, which still keeps the peasantry, a third of the population living on less than $1 a day. And it was really interesting how what was motivating him was that these Filipino Americans understand that in terms of what they were doing there, and so as part of what it means to belong or be part of the homeland or to return. I thought was really interesting. As far as other groups, you know, that I'm not really sure how to answer that. So, you know, another thing that the Faces group did was it joined the protest during the, they don't do State of the Nation, they do, or yes, the State of the Nation address, SONA, where it's tradition in the Philippines to like have these huge mass rallies and they burn effigies. One of our students in American Studies is doing her dissertation work on that. And so, you know, Faces as an organization was part of the, as a part of the protest, and it isn't necessarily about, sorry, the page that I skipped was actually about legal discourse and how, you know, this reliance on legal discourse, you know, it fails to see how, how it circumscribes the extent of what giving can be, you know, as it's connected to state governance and all that. So as a diaspora organization, the seemingly deterritorialized possibilities of the environment and the diaspora, you know, if you focus on law, it's hard to see how the law, you know, it produced these logics and forms of political rationality in the first place. So they kind of position, in their transformation as an organization, they kind of position themselves against that as kind of a goal.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, though, and I think that's one of the things that I find the most interesting about Faces is how they're, again, sort of, as you said in the presentation, that, you know, that epic failure, losing the lawsuit, really became an incredible opportunity to reimagine what constitutes the political. And I think that's one of the things that I think is most interesting about that particular trip, is how they then are working to rethink the political and then reposition the Filipino Americans in relationship to the political.
Yeah.
And so that, you know, the work that the women are doing in the bar, I can never remember the name of the organization. Book. I want to call it something else, and it's not right. You know, Bookload, yeah. Is again the terrain of the political and the environmental and the diasporic in a way that, you know, political organizations, you know, the Democratic Radical organization you just mentioned, right, does that, right, but at a different scale and a different layer of politics.
Right.
And so I think that I'm just going to repeat myself and just say that that's what I really, really like about the Faces example, is how it really is sort of rethinking what constitutes the political. And then again, your ethnographic work shows how that people are then, through this sort of experiential, you know, because they're tourists, right? But it's tourism with a purpose. Right. And that there is a way to sort of get people to think about these things in political terms. Yeah. But yet it does require sort of a rethinking of what it is that they're doing. Right.
And they're not tourists attached to that dominant environment.
No. Right, yeah. But I mean, but you know, it's still a way of thinking, but it's still operating within sort of, you know, they're visitors.
Yes.
They're return, but then they're visitors, but yet they're also kind of like tourists, and you know, it's like it's a temporary, you know, kind of experience that they're having, and what do you have to do to, you know, when we're talking about something that is temporary, in transit, what kinds of possibilities are available for, you know, again, transforming people's thinking and behaviors. And I think that that's one of the things that's interesting about this particular example, is what Faces is able to do to transform Filipino Americans' behaviors and understanding.
Yeah, and it is precisely because of that legal failure, the legal solutions right, are then not only circumscribed by legal discourse and governance of colonial state, but that, you know, I've talked with Hoku about, it's what opens them up to decolonizing gender and race and sexuality in a way that allows for the possibility of different kinds of coalitions with indigenous groups, right? Because that's exactly that moment of possibility
Yeah.
through that shift in organizational focus.
Yeah.
Patrick.
Oh, go ahead. No, I defer to.
The boss.
I know, I'm sure you have something much smarter than me to say.
Go ahead, Zach.
Well, anyway, Joyce, thanks. It was great to hear the talk, and I'm sorry I had to run out for a second to see my daughter for something. And I might have missed it, but could you maybe just remind us just the general composition of the group that goes on this tour?
Oh yeah, I didn't really go through it.
And also kind of what they do then afterwards with that experience?
Yeah. So this was their first trip, and then they've only had it sporadically since. But it targets college age students. That's how they kind of reach out. So they were mostly from San Diego, a couple from the wet East Coast, and one from Hawaii. They're all college aged, as well as, there are other people that were coming along, like boyfriends and girlfriends and parents of the members of the organization. But before they go on the trip, they are asked to attend in person or virtually, what is the word for consciousness? Kamalayan in Tagalog? Anyone? Consciousness education, where they learn about not only the specific environmental projects and U.S. colonialism, as well as the different kinds of ways to group organizing in the Philippines. And then they go on this trip, and then they come back and they do some check-ins. A couple of them did internships with them, but it's largely, the trip is a program of itself, in and of itself. So I don't think they do long-term, like trying to get these students to eventually, become some sort of specialist or organizational leader. But yeah, I don't know.
Did you get any sense from talking to the folks afterwards? Or did you get to follow up with them after the camp?
I followed up with 3 of them after maybe 3 months after, so not long term. Not long term.
Thanks.
So, thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the story of sort of the framing of sex work, particularly within the critique that you were giving around recycling, because I sort of saw, what was really interesting to me, I know those are different frames in the talk.
Right.
But what was really interesting to me was that sort of this idea, in the US it's like, all you have to do is recycle. And it's like, that doesn't really work if there's a giant incinerator, blowing fumes into the air. And it's this very sort of liberal discourse, and it's totally underwrites, the critique that you're making around humanitarianism.
Yeah.
Even though you're bringing this deeper analysis of groups that are trying to do that through diasporic giving, right? So, and I feel like sex workers are always the ones that the U.S. wants to rescue.
Right.
And it's not just, it's a Western humanitarian frame, but it's also then reproduced through NGOs all throughout Asia and Southeast Asia. And so that quote that you had with the interview where he's saying like, oh, I had no idea she's like a sex worker. And then before that you were sort of talking about the way sex workers are framed also in the Philippines. So I just wanted to hear more.
Yeah, I think that because it isn't about pity or saving, and it's not about shame or guilt as well. It was really significant to the participants as well as to the organization that it was this sex worker organization that was leading the charge for environmental cleanup around the US military bases. It was significant to the participants in the organization that they were labor organizers, right? You know, their labor was sex work, but they were labor organizers, and I think that is what, you know, that is what is so occluded in environmental discourse that only sees the smiling Filipino, is the kind of material realities and struggles and conditions of Filipinos as, you know, as people trying to just live and be healthy, but also as workers that are you know, in a larger global economic order. So it's, you know, I'm trying to make this. This is one of the newest point. That was one of the newest points that I added just in the past couple days.
Yeah, I really liked it.
But just like, what does it mean to decolonize, you know, gender, race, and sexuality? But it's you know, that would say that the prostitute is either a figure for pity or should be on the margins of society.
Mm-hmm.
So if you consider her production not only from the US military bases, but also in the sexualization of, you know, island spaces, you know, intervening, you know, to decolonize that, to intervene in that is thinking about not only, you know, what does it mean to see her as historical and intellectual agent?
Mhm.
I'm still thinking about it though.
No, thank you.
I know.
Right, thank you. I don't even know if this is an appropriate academic
Love an
enough
appropriate.
question, but I guess I would like to know a little bit more about how your identity, how you self-identify, and kind of how that played a role or didn't play a role in your attraction to this topic and your sort of your academic focus.
Oh, I appreciate the question. I might burst out in tears, but I think it's important because, you know, I hope I didn't tell this story at my job talk. That I'm just totally one note. But, so I came to this project in general, so like Brian said, the title of my book manuscript is Charity Begins at Home, Filipino Diaspora and the Politics of Giving. I came to this project, my dad was an eye surgeon, but he was sick from when he was like 40 to when he died. And so he didn't really work from when I was a kid. Instead of working, he put all of his energy and joy into doing medical eye missions in the Philippines, where he'd gather, you know, cataract implants and medicines, and then he'd get a team of residents in the Philippines to go to these remote villages and barrios. And it was so important for him, and he was a super goofy, fun-loving, everyone loved him kind of guy. But like one of my very few memories of him being serious and talking to me like straight up, except for like a couple times when I was in trouble, but like just like talking to me was he was saying how important it was for him that his kids know the Philippines through these missions. He says, you know, Joyce, I'm grateful that I got sick because I always wanted to be a missionary anyway. He was born again, and he wanted to be being a missionary was his life's dream, but his parents made him become a doctor. And but he's like, this is how I want you to know the Philippines, because middle class Filipinos, you go back, you spend a lot of time in air conditioning, you go to the malls, and that's, for a lot of people, that's the extent of vacation, right? In fact, my cousins, that's all they've ever known. So he's like, I want you guys to come with me. And so we went. Those were my times. So ever since going as a little kid, the first times that I went back as an adult were joining him on these trips to the Philippines. And then on this one particular trip, you know, we were in this provincial hospital, and this one, I remember very vividly, this young midwife, she must have been like 17, and she looked at me and she was like, I am so jealous of you. I can't believe that you get to go to school and, you know, live in the United States. And, you know, at the time, I was pretty young, and I was with my family, and I was feeling super isolated. I was like, like I hadn't come out yet, and I was with my family, an extended family, and it was like this big issue, and I don't speak Tagalog, and it was like I was feeling so isolated and alienated. And then this moment that she tells she's practically, I don't know, it was I didn't know what to do with my discomfort at the time, and so meanwhile we were doing this medical mission in relationship to in partnership with the North American Baptist Church. And I had a very young understanding of the history of American Protestant relationship to colonization, right? They tried to save the Philippines, a Catholic nation. And having an awareness of that, it was very confusing to me why we were Baptist missionaries, right? And so that's how I began to came to this idea for the project and kind of complicating humanitarianism or giving back as well as return and diaspora.
Actually, that's what I was going to ask you. How would you compare this kind of diasporic returns with this humanitarian kind of objectives with like the medical missions?
Yeah.
And also, well, perhaps other groups that return don't necessarily have that humanitarian mission, but they do have this kind of consciousness raising behind it.
Yeah.
Like students going for these
The Philippine
study
studies.
abroad,
Yeah.
trips to the Philippines, and just buddy binds in general, taking their kids like your father took you,
Yeah.
1.5 or the second generation. Just in terms, not so much the, like I said, the humanitarian aspects, but just consciousness raising about being a Filipino American and the relationship to the Philippines.
Yeah, I mean, besides these college groups and, relatively smallish handful of, more self-identified rabble-rousing groups, I've found very little about, of this consciousness raising as Filipino Americans. In fact, I'm finding it very difficult to do the opposite, which is to talk about the complexity of giving and of homeland to Filipino Americans with very deep investments. The last time I gave a colloquium talk, a member of the Philippine consulate was there, as well as someone affiliated with the university, and they reamed me because I was talking about, and I'm open to critique, but this reason why they reamed me was they were talking about. So the biggest player in Filipino diaspora philanthropy today is the Ayala Foundation, which is the Philippines' second largest corporate conglomerate. Not only did it privatize water in Manila, but it also helped usher in export processing zones. And this is the biggest player by far in Filipino American philanthropy. And I was talking about that, talking about how diaspora attaches itself to neoliberal logics. And at the end, they were like, pretty much, how dare you? Because this organization, the Ayala Foundation, raises money in the U.S. from Filipino American associations to build classroom technology in the Philippines, and a lot related to education. And I find it, it's very difficult to kind of find a space into that to talk about the complexity of giving and homeland. And the medical mission one is interesting. I actually joined. For my field work, I joined 3 different medical missions to the Philippines, and I ended up not writing about it at all because I wasn't sure what to do with it. I think I still might, but it is very interesting to me. This is I don't have an analysis, but it is so interesting to me. So you go on these medical missions to the Philippines, and meanwhile, you go to these provinces. Some provincial hospitals have 0 doctors right now. Every single doctor in the provincial hospital has come to the U.S. as a nurse. So there's 0 doctors in the vicinity. And so they start to depend on these medical missions of Filipino Americans to come back sporadically, maybe with some medication, maybe not, maybe doing some surgery and dental work, maybe just checking some people out. And it's very interesting how that, that love of homeland becomes, is connected to not only the NGOization of the world and this dependence on this larger macro level, but these networks of migration and outmigration and return. I don't have much of an analysis.
That sort of gets me to the, like, kind of the historical question of, when you talk about the entanglement between philanthropy and corporate capitalism, I mean, that's certainly not only Filipino, right?
No,
I mean,
right.
I mean, from Rockefeller to Warren
Yeah,
Buffett,
yeah.
like, you know, there's, I mean, it's very
No, that's a
entangled. So to what extent is this particular dynamics of Filipino philanthropic tradition and structure product of U.S. colonialism, or is it
No,
not?
that's
Like,
a great point. I love that point. Because, like, you know, American colonialism was all, you know, this. There were groups in Hawaii in the 1920s who were organizing to give back to the Philippines. But what I talk about in terms of diaspora, I'm doing this as part of new research, is that so Marcos regime, I would argue, was the first moment where the Philippine American community really kind of united in a common orientation toward the Philippines in the anti-martial law organizing moment of the 1960s and 70s, right? Or 70s and 80s. So when Marcos was deposed, if you look at the newspaper articles, the next week there was like 3 different articles, like in the New York Times even, where they interviewed Filipino Americans and say, thank God that is done. Now we can all come together in social development. Now we can now use our resources to give back. So, but it's not an accident. So it's not causal, but it's overlapping. So not only do we have the professional class of the post-65 Filipino Americans now in the position, for example, to create these projects, but you know, Marcos had just deposed in '86, right? This is that consolidation of the global neoliberal order, right, from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and so it kind of overlaps in time. But what's interesting that when talking about diaspora and philanthropy, it's not that, philanthropy and, you know, it's critique about how it contains critique of capitalism and all that. But for diaspora, that moment from anti-martial law to social development happened like literally overnight. So it's really interesting and kind of tracing in terms of like orientations toward the Philippines. So it's kind of a different kind of historicization of Filipino America from this coming together in a common orientation through anti-martial law to social development. It really, I mean, from what I've seen, it really did happen overnight.
So we're out of time for today, but join me in thanking Joyce one more time for